In this week's In-Ear Insights, let's talk about the attitudes and obstacles that we run into when trying to help people become more data-driven. One of the biggest data-driven companies, or theoretically data-driven companies, based on their academic publications, their open sourcing of certain types of software, their technical research, is the company Netflix, which I think probably does not need a whole lot of explanation as to who they are. And in some background reading I was doing, I came across an article from then Chief Content Officer, now CEO, Ted Sarandos, back in 2018, when they were talking about how they use data to make decisions about, for example, which shows to keep, which shows to get rid of. And Sarandos said in a statement that baffled me, he said, while data is a tool for them, their various projection models and cost analyses do not dictate the decisions. You said it's 70% gut and 30% data, Sarandos said. Most of the time, it's informed hunches and intuition. Data either reinforces your worst notion or it just supports what you want to do either way. And the first thing that popped into my mind when I read this quote was, that's not how that works. Data is not there to justify the decision you already made. Data is supposed to help you make the decision in the first place. So, Katie, when we're talking about change management and helping organizations make better decisions, this attitude is not unique to Netflix. It's shocking that it comes from a company that is ostensibly so data-driven, but it is not unique to them. How do we encourage people past this point of view of data reinforces the decisions I've already made to let's use data to actually make the decision?
So there's a couple of things. You're right. This is not a unique point of view. And I think more often than not, data is used to back up something that somebody already wants to do, or they look at the data and ignore it because it doesn't align with what they want to do. And so what we're talking about is being proactive versus being reactive. And so a data-driven organization is proactive versus what Netflix is using their data for in this instance, and that's reactive. And so by that, I mean, you put the data first or you put the data last. And so this person has already made their decisions. And so then they're just sort of like looking at the data to go, did I make the right decision? It doesn't matter. I've already made my decision versus let me go ahead and start with the data before I make any decisions. And that's going to be the hardest thing to change in terms of a culture. Like, so you have one individual person who might struggle with, well, I know the weather says it's going to be a blizzard and it's going to rain, but I really want to go out today. So I'm going to go out anyway, regardless of what the data is telling me. Or I'm working really hard to, maintain my health. And it looks like I've hit my calorie quota for the day, but you know what? I really want that cookie, so I'm going to do it anyway. And so we as humans would need to overhaul our thinking in terms of what the data represents to us. Is it just something that's there and annoying, or is it something we actually use? And so you're talking about a couple of different types of people. When you bring that into a larger scenario where you have not just one person, but a whole organization of people that you're trying to get them to put the data first and not just make decisions and then use the data later, like that's a huge culture shift. And so this is just me sort of outlining the nuts and bolts of why it's so difficult, because we as humans are not necessarily hardwired to put the data first. We work on instinct and wants and needs, and then we might check the data later. Or the data didn't exist for us, and now we're just sort of catching up to the data that exists around these things that we're trying to make decisions on. So all of that being said, in this instance where we're talking about trying to get a company, a person, a team to put the data first, we need to help them understand why they need to be doing that. So like, what's in it for me? As an individual, if I put the data first, how does that make my life easier, make my life harder? What do I get out of it? The sort of the selfish part of it. And so, helping them understand why putting the data first is a better option than not. And it's gonna come with some uphill battles of, well, it's going to take longer for you to make a decision, but it will be a better decision. And that's where it's going to be the crux of the conversation is, right, but you just said it's going to take longer and I can make a decision without the data.
And so I guess your two basic levers is here's how this will improve profitability or whatever. And I think the other one that perhaps folks who are in the trenches from a data data profession don't think about as much, but could be useful for building alliances within an organization is risk reduction. Real simple example. So you have two employees, employee A, employee B. They both perform the same job. They both have the same KPIs and their KPIs are comparable. If you like employee A more than employee B, maybe employee A is a man, maybe employee B is a woman, and you pay employee A 11% more. From a data perspective, they are performing the same job, creating the same output, and therefore they should have the same compensation. From a human emotion input, you like employee A more. Maybe there's a bias that you have in your judgment. From a risk reduction perspective, I think you could make the case that the data suggests that you have to pay these two employees identically for identical work. And if you don't do that, you are at risk of lawsuits and all sorts of other things. And at that point, it's not just the data person being able to say, hey, this is a problem, but it can work with HR and compliance and other departments within the company, legal, to say, we have a problem and we need to become data-driven to avert this problem. If we don't, these are the consequences.
But what if you don't know what those consequences would be? So let's say I'm a, marketing specialist, marketing analyst, whatever you want to call me, and I'm being asked to set up a social media campaign. Instead of checking, where my audience is or how much I should be spending, I just go ahead and do it. And I put it on the wrong channel and it doesn't perform. It's in my head, worst possible outcome is like, I've wasted my time, maybe a little bit of money. So that to me is not a big enough risk to say, let me go ahead and put the data first. I'm just going to keep doing things until something works. How do you counteract that?
And in that particular instance, you need comparable supporting data. So you have your account, and then you have, say, 3 other competitor accounts, peer competitors. And you can say, look, your numbers are not even close to the competitors. Your competitors are clocking a 7% engagement rate. You're clocking a 1% engagement rate. You are objectively doing a worse job with the tactics, with the tools, the processes that you are using right now. You're objectively just doing a worse job. And we need you to get to parity with our competitors. Right? So what's your plan to get to parity with our competitors? And, you can let that person flounder for a little while and say, hey, how about let's try some data?
But it's interesting because you're talking about it from the perspective of the manager talking to the team member. And, so if you're telling me we're not doing as well as our competitors, what's your plan to get there? You're still not convincing me, the person who needs to change their attitude, that I need to be using data. You're just yelling at me, basically. You're just telling me I'm not doing a great job. And so the likelihood is that I'm just going to quit and go find someone who's not going to yell at me. So that's not helping me change my attitude about putting the data first.
Right, but we got rid of you out of the organization, so that was a win.
This is why you don't manage the people.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think honestly, that's, and I think that that's a very common scenario when people are trying to quote unquote encourage their team members to look at the data, is they're approaching it from a place of frustration. They're approaching it from a place of underperformance. And so that's not very motivating. And so, to sort of put it into a context that a lot of people can understand, let's say, you have certain fitness goals and you've been working with a trainer and you show up to your training session and the trainer says, you didn't hit the mark. I have 6 other clients this week who have put in the work and you have not put in the work this week. So you're not going to, reach your goals. So what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to sit on the floor and cry because you just yelled at me. That's not very motivating. And I'm probably going to fire you as a trainer, and so you have to think about the opposite. Like, okay, what's going on that you didn't look at the plan that I set out for you? What's going on that you didn't check your stats every single day? And so it's not like for lack of a better term,
it's both carrot and stick?
It is, yeah. It is carrot and stick because when you're working with people who need to put data first and they're not putting data first, you need to understand why. And so are they impulsive? Are they, just want to get things done? Do they have a fear of like not getting things done or slowing down or like whatever the thing is? So you have to dig into a little bit of psychology. And so that then becomes the carrot once you understand the thing that's going to motivate them. If you can hit these numbers, then you're likely to hit your own personal goals of getting a promotion within the next 12 months, whatever the thing is. And so you need to understand that piece of it. And then from the organization standpoint, they need to understand where they fit in, to the whole puzzle. And so if you do your job, this over here does their job and this team does their job. And then we all get a big ass bonus at the end of the year. And so helping them understand where they fit into the Jenga tower.
Okay. So in the example we started with, one of the, and this requires a lot more background or anything, but one of the personality characteristics that prevents that individual from being data driven appears to be flat out arrogance. Like, I know better. I'm the CEO, I know better. And that's a situation where there isn't, if you don't have any supervisor, you have no role authority. You may have relationship authority, but you have absolutely no role power to change that person's behavior because literally everybody reports to them. So in that situation, what do you do?
Well, you wait for the company to go under.
So update your LinkedIn profile with our new free Trust Insights LinkedIn course at trustinsights.ai/LinkedIn course.
Which is a real thing, so go check it out.
It really is a thing. Yeah.
No, but in all honesty, I mean, that's where, you're playing the longer game. And so let's say, Chris, I keep making impulsive decisions because I think I know best based on some random article I read that aligns with what I think is my point of view. And so therefore I'm like, oh, well, this article says I don't need to, lead with data. I just need to lead with my really great gut instinct. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that because I'm the CEO and I can. I guarantee people who are listening to this have heard this conversation before in their own personal experience. And so your job, Chris, is not to keep telling me blatantly, hey, Katie, you're wrong, because you already know I'm not going to hear it. I'm not going to hear the words, you're wrong. I'm going to hear, okay, you're just being a problem. So Chris, I need to figure out how to get rid of you. The approach there is then to keep presenting information. Be like, hey, I found this, information that shows if we did it this way, we would get better results. And you narcissistic, arrogant jackass would look so much better. There's so much psychology involved with all of this. And I think that that's the hard part for people who are purely data-driven or want to be data-driven, is understanding the human psychological side of it, is that in order to get the basic black and white, the data says do X, the amount of psychology that goes into it to get more than just yourself on board is a big effort.
And psychology is not something that data-driven folks are generally given a whole lot of training on, if any. I mean, psychology is not something people in general are not given a whole
I was going to say, in general, we're not trained unless that's, what you go to school for.
Exactly. So for maybe someone like me who's, a numbers nerd, where do we start to learn that? How do we start to learn that, particularly if we ourselves are not all that self-aware?
That's where having a really good associate, a partner, a community to, maybe lean on for your deficits. And so, Chris, this is one of the reasons why you and I work so well together is I understand and can do the psychology aspect of it, but I also respect the data aspect of it. And you can respect that there needs to be a psychology piece of it, and you can present the data. And so bringing those two pieces together. And so this is where, when we talk about goal setting or we talk about, communities or really anything, like there is rarely an instance in your personal professional life where you are doing something solo. You are leaning on other people to fill in the gaps that you yourself, need support with. And so in your example, what do you do with someone who's more data than psychology? Find someone who can fill in those gaps of the psychology, a trusted person, an associate. So maybe you're working on a marketing team. Maybe you're working on a data analytics team, an epidemiology team, an IT team, whatever. Maybe look outside your discipline and say, hey, I recognize that you're really good at talking to customers and understanding what they need. Do you think maybe you could help me? I'm working on this project and I need to convince the CEO, that we need to be putting the data first. What advice would you give me to convince them? Pretend they're a customer, pretend they're this. Like, work with someone who has those strengths instead of just trying to muddle through and figure it out on your own. And it might be outside of your team. It might even be outside of your organization.
That reminds me of a life hack that I heard a long time ago from Sue Jomti, who was involved in the VC space. She said, if you ask for what you want, you're going to get advice. If you ask for advice, you're going to get advice, but you're also probably going to get what you want, which is because you make that person an ally by helping them feel like they're an expert or they're in a position of power or dominance. And as such, it's a way to sort of sneak in, like we were talking about, Katie, sneak in, helping the person think it's their idea. Like, oh, yeah, you know where you want them to go. Like, I need you to make this decision. But hey, what's your advice about getting to this? And the person does that, and then suddenly they're like, oh, and you should do the thing that we really want them to do to begin with.
Well, and I want to be clear when we talk about the psychology of it, I'm not talking about manipulating people. Don't straight up start manipulating people to you to get what you want. That's self-serving. It's really more of just understanding what motivates them so that you can meet them where they're at. And so if I'm someone who needs to feel like I'm right all the time, your job isn't to unpack that with me and course correct and, whatever. Your job is to give me what I need to do my job. And so it's, you're not truly playing psychologist, you're just understanding the psychology. And so I just want to put that disclaimer on there that your job is not to start to try to dig into people's heads and fix their childhood traumas. You're trying to get a job done. And so by understanding the motivations of individuals that you need to get decisions from, you can then start to speak their language and meet them where they're at, because that's what they're going to hear and respond to versus you saying, we need to use the data. We just need to use the data. That's not going to get you very far. And it's a waste of everybody's time. And so, you're absolutely right. So, by putting people in that position of, well, you're the subject matter expert, you're really just playing into their ego. It's not a manipulation because you're not trying to ultimately change who they are. You shouldn't have, a nefarious agenda, change the course of the whole business. Yeah. Again, Chris, it's why you're not allowed to do this.
No, I mean, that makes sense. And figuring out those motivations, in some ways, it's the two different kinds of data we've been talking about forever, right? You have quantitative data, which is the numbers, and the numbers that you use to set goals and know that you've achieved things. And then there's the qualitative data, which is the emotions, the intangibles. And if you're someone who's more like me, who focuses very heavily on the quantitative data, we do forget that qualitative data exists, and we do forget that we need to align the quantitative data with the qualitative things that are going to make people feel better or motivate them to take action in directions that we know the business needs to go.
So let's say I wasn't, in the picture, Chris, and you were tasked with, getting someone to put the data first. After this conversation, what plan would you start to put together?
The first thing would be, and this is, the whole volunteer movement
Sure.
thing that I've been doing on the side is very much about that. Like, what is the motivation of the stakeholder?
Uh-huh.
What is it that motivates them? What are they held accountable for? And what are sort of the underlying factors that go into it? So in a publicly traded company, yeah, the earnings per share is a key metric, right? But an earnings per share number is not super motivating, right? It just basically means you're making a whole bunch of other people rich. So what are the personality traits of those stakeholders? Are they arrogant? Like, do they need fame? Are they greedy? Do they need money? They motivate money. Are they hedonistic? Are they motivated by sensuality and things like that? Are they fear driven? Right? Are they motivated by loss aversion? And depending on the personality type, that can better help. I would put together a plan saying, okay, here's the decision that we need them to make. Here are the things that are inherent to them in a qualitative perspective that are blocking that. This person's an arrogant person, and so the data is not going to matter to them. You can say whatever you want in data language, and they will not care. What are they motivated by? Well, they're motivated by status. They want to be seen as experts in the industry. They want to be seen as leaders in their industry. Okay, how do we get to that? Well, if they were able to showcase just how smart their machine learning infrastructure is and how it's better than their peers, then they get to make those bold claims. Okay, well, if that's the case, then how do we illustrate to them, okay, well, to do that, to get to that fame, you need to use the data that machine learning infrastructure is spitting out. And so there's sort of a chain of events of, here's the motivation, here's the underlying factors in that, here's what we have available to us, and then can we structure the story that we're telling them? Because data, despite what people say, data doesn't tell a story. People tell stories to other people with data. And so we have to figure out, okay, well, how do we take this information and convey it in a story that resonates? Back in a while ago, I was done some reading on neurolinguistic programming about some of these manipulation techniques, frankly. But one of the things I liked about what they said was everybody's mind is like a doorway, right? And all the doorways are different shape, different angles and stuff like that. And the information you have to convey is in the form of a mattress. The mattress is only going to go through that doorway a certain way, right? And everyone's doorway is different. So if you just fling the mattress, it's only going to get through like a few doorways, and most doorways is going to bounce right off. You have to take the time to say, okay, how can I turn the mattress to fit that specific doorway and get the information in based on how that person's ready to receive it? And that's, essentially the plan that I would take if I didn't have, trusted advisors and people like you to ask, what's the approach for this person? How do we deal with this person?
And so it's interesting because, we are working under the assumption that the stakeholder is, arrogant and out of touch and, all of those things. I'm human and I can certainly be those things, but I would like to believe that that's not my core personality. And so I would imagine, Chris, that the approach that you would take with me would be different than the approach that you would take with someone who, is more egotistical, for example, and so, it would just like in a 60-second sentence, like, let's say I wasn't using the data and you needed to convince me, like, just give me a quick elevator pitch of an approach that you would give to someone like me versus someone who believes that, data is an afterthought.
Arrogance is definitely not one of your core personality traits and things. So, in the case of someone like you, it's almost, you take an almost opposite approach of providing a sense of reassurance, a sense of comfort, a sense of security. Like, hey, I know that sometimes you question whether you're making the right decision or not, right? Here's some things that we're not manipulating the data to fit a view of the world. We're saying we've used data to validate, free of bias, free of our own emotional investment, that in fact the decision you're trying to make is the correct decision, or these are the three paths, and here are the results of what will happen if you have data that says this is the probable outcome. You have data that says this is the problem outcome. You have data that says this is the probable outcome. And someone who wants to see the big picture and have all the facts on the table before you make a decision, you could look at that and go, well, I know I don't want that because that's a flaming dumpster. That's okay. That one looks reasonable. So I'm going to take the one that looks like a reasonable balance of risk and reward. Again, for somebody who wants that reassurance of making good decisions and is more cautious by nature, that's the approach you take. Ass kissing doesn't matter because it won't resonate with that person. Like, you're not telling me anything I don't know. Instead, say, here's the menu of three options, only three options. Good, better, best, however you want to phrase it. And then let that person choose from the options, knowing that from a data perspective, you've done the work to say, here's the likely outcomes.
And so I bring that up because there are different approaches that need to be taken. And so you've just described two very different approaches to trying to convince someone to use the data to make the decision. You have the person that is more risk averse, more cautious, really just needs that reassurance that, things aren't going to go sideways if I make this decision. And then you have the person who's like, my idea is the best idea ever. I don't need the data, but really they need the data. And then there's all the different versions of that in between. And so you could have 100 different people and 100 different approaches to how you need to help them and support them to use the data to make better decisions. And so, this is why, at least from where I sit, there is no one answer other than understanding the person that you're trying to work with, even just trying to meet them halfway.
And what's really uncomfortable for people who are very quantitative, people who are like me, is that even just the two examples we've just outlined, you're not using the data. You're not leading with the data. You are leading with a story that you constructed from the data. But It is your obligation as a data person to transform data into a story that someone else can digest. And I hate that about human beings. It's a lot easier for me to work with the machines. Like, here's the data. The machine's like, got it. This is one of the reasons why we like things like ChatGPT. Here's a bunch of data, turn it into a story. Right? That's, when you think about like generative AI, that's really what it's doing. And so it's one of the things that's so compelling to us, because human beings communicate primarily through stories. We have ever since we, crawled out of caves or dropped out of the trees or whatever, and, figured out fire. We've been telling stories around the campfire for millennia. And so as data-driven folks, we have to remember that at the end of the day, we are telling a story. It's just a story we've constructed from data.
Whereas I am definitely the person who wants to sit around the campfire for hours telling stories.
And that's a skill that data folks have to rediscover.
Oh yeah, there's definitely give and take on both sides of it. I need to, it's not that I don't put the data first, but I like the story, I like the action, I like the insights, and you like the data. And so that's, again, why you and I work so well together, because it's a nice complement of skills. And so I guess the takeaway for people who are listening to this, as they are trying to figure out which side of, the fence they sit on with this, it's okay to be one or the other. Very rarely can people do both well. People can do both, but not at an expert level on both sides of the fence. And so my advice would be to find someone you trust, someone you can partner with who complements those skills. So if you're the data person, find the storyteller. If you're the storyteller, find the data person. And then that way, those two things together become an unstoppable force, because then you can do all things. You can convince people, hey, here's the data, because you're meeting your stakeholders, your customers, your decision makers where they are with the story and the data.
Exactly right. If you've got stories that you would like to share about data, pop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on, we probably have it there. Go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. We can find all the different options. And hey, whatever platform you're on, please leave us a rating and a review. It does help to share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.